lie this time. And it's the truth, and this time it's got to be told. I've written my last false story. This one is going to the people the way it is. This one's going to be the truth." He stopped staring at her. The puzzling, twisted hole in the puzzle was suddenly there, staring him in the face, falling down into place in his mind with blazing clarity. Staring, he dived into the pile of papers again, searching, frantically searching for the missing piece. Something he had seen, and passed over. The one single piece of the story that didn't make sense. And he found it, on the list of materials shipped to the Nevada plant. Pig iron, raw magnesium, raw copper, steel electron tubes, plastics from all parts of the country, all being shipped to the Dartmouth plant in Nevada, where they made only shells. At first he thought it was only a rumble in his mind, the shocking realization storming through. Then he saw Ann jump up suddenly, white-faced, and race to the window, and he heard the small scream in her throat. And then the rumbling grew louder, stronger, and the house trembled. He heard the whine of jet planes screaming over the house as he joined her at the window, heard the screaming whines mingled with the rumbling thunder. And far away on the horizon, the red glare was glowing, rising, burning up to a roaring conflagration in the black night sky. "Washington!" Her voice was small, infinitely frightened. "Yes, that's Washington." "Then it really has started." She turned to him with eyes wide with horror, and snuggled up to his chest like a frightened child. "Oh, Tom!" "It's here. What we've been waiting for. What your father started could never be stopped any other way than this." The roar was louder now, rising to a whining scream as another squad of dark ships roared overhead, moving east and south, jets whistling in the night. "This is what your father wanted." She was crying, great sobs shaking her shoulders. "You're wrong! You're wrong! Oh, Tom, you must be wrong!" His voice was low, almost inaudible in the thundering roar of the bombardment. "Ann, I've got to go ahead. I've got to go tonight. To Nevada, to the Dartmouth plant there. I know I'm right, but I have to go, to check something, to make sure of something." He paused, looking down at her. "I'll be back, Ann." "But I'm afraid of what I'll find out there. I need you behind me, especially with what I have to do. I need you. You've got to decide, are you for me, or against me?" She shook her head sadly, and sank into a chair, gently removing his hands from her waist. "I love my father, Tom," she said in a beaten voice. "I can't help what he's done. I loved him. I can't be with you, Tom." Far below him he could see the cars jamming the roads leaving Washington. He could almost hear the noise, the screeching of brakes, the fist fights, the shouts, the blatting of horns. He moved south over open country, hoping to avoid the places where the copter might be spotted and stopped for questioning. He knew that Hart would have an alarm out for him by now, and he didn't dare risk being stopped until he reached his destination, the place where the last piece of the puzzle could be found, the answer to the question that was burning through his mind. Shells were made of steel and chemicals. The tools that made them were also made of steel, not manganese, not copper, not electron relays, nor plastic, nor liquid oxygen. Just steel. The copter relayed south and then turned west over Kentucky. Shander checked the auxiliary tanks which he had filled at the library landing field that morning. Then he turned the ship to robot controls and sank back in the seat to rest. His whole body clamored for sleep, but he knew he dare not sleep. Any slip, any contact with Army aircraft or security patrol would throw everything into the fire. For hours he sat, gazing hypnotically at the black expanse of land below, flying high over the pitch-black countryside. Not a light showed, not a sign of life. Bored, he flipped the radio button, located a news broadcast. The bombed area did not extend west of the Appalachians. Washington, D.C. was badly hit, as were New York and Philadelphia, and further raids were expected to originate from Siberia, coming across the Great Circle to the West Coast or the Middle West. So far the enemy appears to have lived up to its agreement in the Ingersoll Pact to outlaw use of atomic bombs, for no atomic weapons have been used so far, but the damage with blockbusters has been very heavy. All citizens are urged to maintain strictest blackout regulations and report as called upon in local work and civil defense pools as they are set up. The attack began. Chandler sighed, checked his instrument readings. Far in the east, the horizon was beginning to lighten, a healthy, white-gray light. His calculations placed him over eastern Nebraska, and a few moments later he nosed down cautiously and verified his location. Lincoln Air Base was a flurry of activity. The field was alive with men, like little black ants, preparing the reserve fighters and pursuits for use in a fever of urgent speed. Suddenly the copter radio bleeped, and Tom threw the switch. Over. An angry voice snarled, "You up there, whoever you are, where'd you leave your brains? No civilian craft are allowed in the air, and that's orders straight from Washington. Don't you know there's a war on? Now get down here, before you're shot down." Chandler thought quickly. "This is a federal security ship," he snapped. "I'm just on reconnaissance." The voice was cautious. "Security, what's your cooperation number?" Chandler cursed. "JF223R-864. Name is Jerry Chandler. Give it a check if you want to." He flipped the switch and accelerated for the ridge of hills that marked the Colorado border as the radio signal continued to bleep angrily. A trio of pursuit planes on the ground began warming up. Chandler sighed, hoping they would check before they sent ships after him. It might at least delay them until he reached his destination. Another hour carried him to the heart of the Rockies, and across the great salt fields of Utah. His fuel tanks were low, being emptied one by one as the tiny ship sped through the bright morning sky, and Tom was growing uneasy, until suddenly, far to the west and slightly to the north he spotted the plant, nestling in the mountain foothills. It lay far below, sprawling like some sort of a giant spider across the rugged terrain. Several hundred cars spread out to the south of the plant, and he could see others speeding in from the temporary village across the ridge. Everything was quiet, orderly. He could see the shipments, crated, sitting in freight cars to the north. And then he saw the drill line running over to the right of the plant. He followed it, quickly checking a topographical map in the cockpit, and his heart started pounding. The railroad branch ran between two low peaks and curved out toward the desert. Moving over it he saw the curve, saw it as it cut off to the left, and seemed to stop in the middle of the desert sand. Chandler circled even lower, keeping one ear cocked on the radio, and settled the ship on the railroad line. And just as he cut the motors, he heard the shrill whine of three pursuit ships screaming in from the eastern horizon. He was out of the copter almost as soon as it had touched, throwing a jacket over his arm and racing for the place where the drill line ended. But he had seen as he slid in for a landing just what he had suspected from the topographical map. The drill didn't end in the middle of the desert at all. It went right on into the mountainside. The excavation was quite large, the entrance covered and camouflaged neatly to give the very impression that he had gotten from the air. Under the camouflage the space was crowded, stacked with crates, boxes, materials, stacked along the walls of the tunnel. He followed the rails in, lighting his way with a small pocket flashlight when the tunnel turned a corner, cutting off the daylight. Suddenly the tunnel widened, opening out into a much wider room. He sensed, rather than saw, the immense size of the vault, smelt the odd, bitter odor in the air. With the flashlight he probed the darkness, spotting the high vaulted ceiling above him. And below him, At first he couldn't see, probing the vast excavation before him, and then, strangely, he saw but couldn't realize what he saw. He stared for a solid minute, uncomprehending, then, stifling a gasp, he knew what he was looking at. Lights! He had to have lights to see clearly what he couldn't believe. Frantically he spun the flashlight, seeking a light panel, and then, fascinated, he turned the little oval of light back to the pit. And then he heard the barest whisper of sound, the faintest intake of breath, and he ducked, frozen, as a blow whistled past his ear. A second blow from the side caught him solidly in the blackness, grunting, flailing out into a tangle of legs and arms, cursing, catching a foot in his face, striking up into soft, yielding flesh. And his head suddenly exploded into a million dazzling lights as he sank unconscious to the ground. It was a tiny room, completely without windows, the artificial light filtering from ventilation slits near the top. Shander sat up, shaking as the chill of the room became painfully evident. A small electric heater sat in the corner beaming valiantly, but the heat hardly reached his numbed toes. He stood up, shaking himself, slapping his arms against his sides to drive off the coldness, and he heard a noise through the door as soon as he had made a sound. Muted footsteps stopped outside the door, and a huge man stepped inside. He looked at Shander carefully, then closed the door behind him, without locking it. "I'm Baker," he rasped cheerfully. "How are you feeling?" Shander rubbed his head, suddenly and acutely aware of a very sore nose and a bruised rib cage. "Not so hot," he muttered. "How long have I been out?" "Long enough." The man pulled out a plug of tobacco, ripped off a chunk with his teeth. "Chew?" "I smoke." Shander fished for cigarettes in an empty pocket. "Not in here you don't," said Baker. He shrugged his huge shoulders and settled affably down on a bench near the wall. "You feel like talking?" Shander eyed the unlocked door, and turned his eyes to the huge man. "Sure," he said. "What do you want to talk about?" "I don't want to talk about nothin'," the big man replied indifferently. "Thought you might, though." "Are you the one that roughed me up?" "Yeah," Baker grinned. "Hope I didn't hurt you much. Boss said to keep you in one piece, but we had to hurry up and take care of those army guys you brought in on your tail. That was dumb. You almost upset everything." Memory flooded back, and Shander's eyes widened. "Yes, they followed me all the way from Lincoln. What happened to them?" Baker grinned and chomped his tobacco. "They're a long way away now. Don't worry about them." Shander eyed the door uneasily. The latch hadn't caught and the door had swung open an inch or two. "Where am I?" he asked, inching toward the door. What are you planning to do to me?" Baker watched him edge away. "You're safe," he said. "The boss'll talk to you pretty soon if you feel like it." He squinted at Tom in surprise, pointing an indolent thumb toward the door. "You planning to go out or something?" Tom stopped short, his face red. The big man shrugged. "Go ahead. I ain't going to stop you," he grinned. "Go as far as you can." Without a word Shander threw open the door, looked out into the concrete corridor. At the end was a large bright room. Cautiously he started down, then suddenly let out a cry and broke into a run, his eyes wide. He reached the room, a large room with heavy plastic windows. He ran to one of the windows, pulse pounding, and stared, a cry choking in his throat. The blackness of the cracks contrasted dimly with the inky blackness of the sky beyond. Mile upon mile of jagged, rocky crags, black rock, ageless, unaged rock. And it struck him with a jolt how easily he had been able to run, how lightning swift his movements. He stared again, and then he saw what he had seen in the pit. Standing high outside the building on a rocky flat, standing bright and silvery, like a phantom finger pointing to the inky heavens, sleep.